have trouble with. And if you imagine for a moment what it must have been like the first time a human creature, or perhaps not even human at that time, developed the sense of sight, even the ability to just see colors, random shadows, brightness, must have been a horrifying discovery. And similarly, if you consider stories of individuals who have been blind their whole lives, who are suddenly given the gift of sight through surgery, they don't see the world as we do. They don't look out and suddenly there are all the faces. What they see is this tremendous, chaotic mesh of movement, lights, colors. They can't really make sense out of it, and apparently it's quite horrifying. Now, one of my pet theories, is that thought is our sixth sense, and we don't have it under control very well. It's a little bit like the sense of sight must have been a few centuries, thousands of years or so after we first developed it. It certainly works. It tells us things. Sometimes it tells us the wrong things. We can't be completely certain about it. We have certain exercises that help us be sure, or at least a little bit more sure, things like logic or scientific method. But in general, it's confusing, and it tends to do a lot more harm at times than good. We can't seem to get control of it. In Buddhism, it has been described as a voracious monkey leaping from tree to tree, grabbing at all the bananas in sight. And that's often the way it feels to us. We can't seem to quiet the thing down. Now, beyond that, Mercury presents a special situation because it's, I think, a planetary or symbolic pair. It's the other half of the moon. And there's, of course, a lot of popularity in the left-hand, right-hand scheme of things, but beyond going into that, it's helpful to realize that for many of us, there is that part of ourselves that is nonverbal, that simply feels, that has intuitions, that has a certain reaction to a person or place, and it cannot be put into words. We have experiences that go with that side of our lives. Mystical experience, for example, is usually impossible to be put into words. And that's why we get these bizarre, long treatises about it's like subjective light and blossoms and flowers and all this stuff. And it really doesn't make any sense because there are no words. There are no material symbols that will capture the immaterial. And in addition, we have our mind. We have our language, our thought. We have all those aspects of our personality that conform fairly well with the objects out here, or at least appear to. So, for example, using language, using thought, I can name that a chair, and I can know that one of the things I can do is I can sit on it, or I can stand on it, maybe a bit more precarious, but I have a whole little repertoire, index cards, if you like, of things that I know about this thing called a chair. But if I happen to be a physicist, the mind begins to take me on a little journey. And the first thing that the mind tells me is this interesting little fact, which is when I do some research about that chair, I discover that no matter how solid it seems, that in fact it's more empty space than anything else. To give you an idea of just how empty it is, if you imagine the distance from the sun to the planet Pluto, and how empty our solar system is, just a few planets, a few asteroids, a little cosmic dust between the sun and Pluto, the electrons and atoms in that chair are 100 times further apart than the sun is from Pluto. So there's 100 times more space in that chair than there is in our solar system. Now you can see that the mind is beginning to get us in a little bit of trouble, or better yet, it's beginning to get itself in a little bit of trouble. It's beginning to find things that just don't make sense. Another interesting thing that happens is, in physics, we'll describe things like the way electricity or electromagnetism behaves. And then you ask the simple question, okay, I now understand how it behaves, but what is it? And the answer you get is, we don't know. It's a postulate. There's no way we can describe it. There's something called electricity. What's energy, you ask? Look it up in the dictionary. They'll tell you the ability to do work. Very strange. What's doing the work? Matter? If you have read your Einstein, you know that matter and energy are transferable. Therefore, it's the ability to do work that's doing work. In other words, paradox on top of paradox, confusion. The mind itself can now reach a point where paradox strikes it and it fails, and we hit that silence, that other side of our being, the moon side, if you like, or other levels. So what do we do with this thing? That seems to be the idea. Most of us tend to have the idea that the mind is here for one of two things. It's supposed to make us very comfortable by telling us how to find a nice niche in the world and protect it from other people, or it's supposed to somehow answer the mysteries of creation. It's supposed to tell us exactly what the world is about. And of course, the history of religion and the history of science is the history of that endeavor, that effort to understand the world, the origin. And the great irony of it is that with all this trying, all the Newtons, all the Einsteins, the Buddhas, we don't have any answers. The only answer we have is that the mind isn't going to do it. But the mind has its limits. The mind can tell us about the material world, but even in the act of telling, it is chopping it up. It's taking bits of it. It's looking at surfaces and missing process. The world actually is a continuum. There's a beautiful school of Buddhism that existed in China around 700 BC called Huayan, AD actually, I'm sorry. Huayan Buddhism, based on a scripture called the Flower Adornment. It's this massive, long sutra. It's a really wonderful bit of literature. And in it is a description of the Buddhas within every atom in the universe. And within all those Buddhas, inside all those atoms, there are other Buddhas in other universes. And it just goes on like this, infinitely. And one of the great points of it is that the universe, which is as close to infinite certainly as anything we can conceive of, we can't conceive a limit to it. We can at least call it infinite so far as our minds are concerned. The universe is interconnected. It all interpenetrates. Huayan Buddhism, for example, believed that the furthest star that we can't even see is somehow connected with us. If that star wasn't there, life would be entirely different. And an example of the way that might be true is simple thing like the law of equilibrium in physics that has to do with the fact that if you move a particle over here, something's going to happen to a particle over there, even if they're not connected. Everything is in balance. So what's the point of all that? The point is, first of all, to convince you in a way that I might have been able to do better with a little Zen cone or something, that the mind is not omniscient, that it cannot provide all the answers for us. And the fact being that we live in a highly mind-dominant culture, we have to attempt to relax away, loosen away from our adhesion to the mind, to mental processes. It's one of our little tasks. It may be that India, using a great generalization, has a great mastery of the spatial sense, of the quiet part of humanity. But they need to work a little bit on what we have so well, mind, reason, that sort of thing. But we, on the other hand, have a great need for cultivating the other sides of experience, the intuitive, the feeling sides. We rely much too heavily on our mentality. So, there then is my justification for the importance of discussing the planet Mercury. The title, having to do with the change from nervousness or anxiety to flexibility, I think says a great deal about the point of the lecture today. And I will explain now what is actually meant by that, and then how we can begin to move in that direction and improve our relationship with our minds. Most of us find that thought gets us into trouble. Thought gets us worrying. Thought gets us messing ourselves up. We miss opportunities because we're so busy mulling them over that we miss them. They whiz past us. Or we, for instance, don't sleep all night because we just can't stop thinking about the particular problem that's facing us the next morning. And of course, we blissfully go down to face the problem without any sleep and probably mess it up quite a bit worse than we would have if we'd been able somehow to put the thoughts aside. Thinking, if you consider driving, for example, often gets in the way. That's the simplest way to put it. If you've ever become very aware of what you're doing when you're driving, this may have happened perhaps a little while after you first learned. You suddenly thought, the clutch, this, that, and you started to think what you were doing, you probably lost control of the car for that split second of hysteria. The thought wasn't able to do it. Your body, your mind, those silent parts are much more aware of what's happening. If you just ease off to them, they shift the gears the way the gears are supposed to be shifted, just as a sense of habit. But the mind gets in there, and this happens with everything. It happens with personal relationships. We get an expectation about another person. They got a certain look in their eyes when we said something, and we go home, we start to think it over. Maybe we're a little tired, and our imagination starts to take over. Next thing we know, we've built this up into a horrendous situation, and if we're really talented, what we do next is, the next time we see that person, we act as if it really happened, and then we create the reality. So, of course, we're justified all along. Same thing in business relations. We walk into a situation and believe something is there, misread a signal, start to think, did we do the right thing? Was that the right thing to do? Maybe we should have done that instead, and clutter up the whole situation. And then our expectations lead on to other experiences that tend to be negative. But what is the mind here for then? Obviously it has its moments. There are moments of discovery, for example, when we think something out and it actually works. And what a tremendous delight that is. Or when we give a little thought to a situation that's in front of us, and instead of it developing into a knot of trouble, it suddenly unravels, and we're quite alert of what it is we're doing. That's the kind of thing that mind can do for us. And of course, mind can do all the lovely things that it's done in the sense of creating books, or creating buildings, or creating all the better aspects of civilization. A limitation of mind might be pointed out by the fact that up until now, in general, we've not been too aware of the fact that when we come up with some terrific invention, like oil fuels, there's usually a lot of elements involved that the mind didn't think of. In other words, it seized on the positive aspects and missed the shadow side. And we're beginning to become a little bit more aware of that now, hopefully not too late to pretty things up a bit. Flexibility is the goal that we're looking for with the mind. Now, what do we mean by flexibility? First of all, when we are anxious, when we're nervous, we are the tools of our minds. Any of you who've been in a really good fit of worrying know that sense of not being able to break free of it. It's as though we've lost control of ourselves for a moment. Those thoughts keep rampaging in our heads. We can't seem to get them to cease. And so we have become instruments in the hands of thought. The idea is for thought to be an instrument. In order to understand, then, how we can use thought as an instrument, we have to begin to see what kind of an instrument it is, what kind of things it can do. For instance, if you want to use a compass to build squares, you're going to be in trouble. You've got to have the idea that a compass is real good for curves and circles, but not for squares. The mind is the greatest tool for adaptation that we have. And I hope to demonstrate this to you. Very often we enter situations that we're not accustomed to and that frighten us. They can frighten us in the most subtle ways, simply make us feel apprehensive, uncomfortable. This is where the mind comes in. The emotions have reported that there is something in this vicinity that bothers us. It might be a reminiscence from childhood. It might be a color that someone is wearing, something as simple as that. We don't really know what it is. We have a few options. Now, obviously, we can overuse the instrument of the mind and begin to take apart every single thing in that situation, understand exactly what it is that's bothering us. That's not usually going to work. Sometimes we have intuitions about that, and those are often very good. A memory will slip in, something will happen to clue us into the fact that this particular problem is connected with something that's happened long ago. But we have a better way to use the mind in that situation, and that is to be reasonable, to look around the situation and begin to think about it. Is there really anything here that's threatening? That's the first step. And it's a pretty quick look around to realize, no, there's nothing here more threatening than anywhere else. The next step after that is to consider, what can I do to change my feeling about this situation from negative to positive? In other words, instead of walking into it expecting to be a victim, how can I now walk into it expecting to do something really positive with it? If you've been fortunate, you've known someone in your lives, or you've at least heard of someone, who is heroic in the truest sense of the word. They walk into the most horrible situations, and somehow, not only do they walk out of them, as it's said in that old cliche, smelling like a rose, but they also manage to turn it into something wonderful. They get a lesson out of it that just blossoms out for them, and they can tell you all about it, and you think to yourself, how did they do that? An example would be a man who, not too long ago, was telling me a story about a time that he was mugged. He got into his truck and found there was someone there with a broken-off bottle. And they had the bottle at his throat. Now, this is a fairly strong man, and a man who is used to a lot of physical work, and his thought immediately started to function. He realized that if he grabbed the person here and he grabbed him there, this sort of thing would happen. It all went very fluently, and although I don't suggest this course of action to the rest of you, he managed to have this guy on the ground throttled very quickly, and realized at that point that he could really hurt him. And of course, with all that rage built up, all that adrenaline, it was a very tempting thing to do. But he didn't. He let him go. The man ran off. The result was that the fellow's car was destroyed. It got into an accident during this process. But what was his reaction to all that? Did he come home and moan to everyone in sight about this terrible, fearful experience he had? Or on the other hand, did he come back and brag about his physical strength and prowess? No. He came back and he said, you know, there must have been some reason why that happened to me. I wonder if maybe because it happened to me, it didn't happen to somebody else who couldn't have defended themselves. I mean, it's a good thing it happened to me. I could handle it. And maybe that guy won't do that again because I scared him. I could have hurt him. And best of all, I controlled my anger and I forgave him. He turned it into a really wonderful experience. No negativity, no anger. Everything just dissipated. He had a kind of blissful smile on his face as he talked about it. In fact, when he introduced the story, I was expecting something entirely different. But there's an extreme example of the kind of approach that's open to us in negative situations. Now, certainly, I can't imagine a more negative situation than one in which our life is being put in danger. Most of us have a more subtle kind of negative situation to deal with. Unpleasant ones, restrictive ones, critical ones, that sort of thing. But the principle, the dynamic, is still the same. We can shift our orientation from the idea that we're a victim, that somehow this situation is going to hurt us, that there's nothing we can do but seek somehow to defend ourselves. We can totally drop that and decide instead that what we're going to do is we're going to find some little chink in the armor and make something positive happen out of this. Find some really open pathway to a resolution or an improvement of the situation, and that's where the mind comes in. In its purest form, the mind works as a kind of fluent communication. It's not analytic. It's not the reason that gets in there. It's something that comes out of a deep integration, a sense of honesty, a feeling that the world is a place that is not fundamentally hostile to us, but is rather a place that we can trust, as was discussed in the lecture on the moon. It's sort of whether you're going to feel that this place is here for a reason, provides you an opportunity for learning, or that it's simply a chaos intended to make you feel agony. A little bit of thought, a little bit of introspection, I think, will indicate to you that the former is the case, and that actually, in this life, the opportunities are marvelous. There's beauty all around us. There's all sorts of wonder. There's all sorts of lessons if we're merely open to it. And generally, we're the ones who place the negative connotations into any situation. Now, when we have a fundamental trust in the world, and we're willing to be honest, in other words, we're not victims, we're agents of a sort, trying to bring about harmony, trying to bring about some kind of improvement wherever we go, then the mind serves us. And usually it does it in the most amazing fashion. For example, you approach a person who doesn't feel too good about you in a working situation or a personal relationship, and you sit down with them and you really want to hear what the problem is. You really want to understand the situation. You're wide open. You're not thinking, am I going to get hurt? Are they going to say something that's going to puncture my ego. You're thinking, what can I do for this person? And you'll be surprised what comes out of your mouth. All of a sudden, you become terribly eloquent. You may not say much, you may say too much, but whatever you say will tend to be straight to the point and very effective. What makes it effective is the selflessness involved. And this then is the essence of what I want to present to you tonight, and that is the idea that the mind truly works only when we have cultivated a condition of selflessness. As long as it serves us, in other words, this illusory self that we postulate, it's going to cause troubles. When we allow it to simply exist in service of ourselves as selfless entities, and I'll discuss that in a moment, then it begins to become a fluent, wonderful thing. Now, why is that? First, let's consider this idea of selflessness. It's one of the bugbears of Buddhism. A lot of Westerners are horrified by the statement in Buddhism that there is no soul, there is no self. And they think, terrible idea, nihilistic. The fact of the matter is that the Buddhists are a great deal more subtle than we give them credit for. It can sometimes be shocking how subtle they are. When they say that there is no self, they're indulging in something in Sanskrit that's called upaya, which is using a falsehood to get across a point, to get a reaction out of you. That's all they're really trying to do. They're trying to shock you. Now, they're trying to get you to think, is the whole idea. So what do they mean by this? There's no soul, there's no self. Well, first of all, they get you thinking about it. That's a major thing. Well, then you start to say, no, I believe there is a soul. Well, then it's up to you to identify it. You'll start to think about it and say, well, there's a sense of consciousness. Let's leave it at that. And there's something that seems to bind my personality and my memories and my emotions. I mean, they're mine, after all. I can share them. You may have almost identical ones. But yet, something about them, I'm the one who views them. This is my diorama, my little movie that's going on. So that's my soul, something in there that makes that unique. Well, that's fine. And the Buddhist will come back at you with the statement that, well, it's not that there's no soul, you see, it's that the soul or the self is nothing. And now we're really getting to the point. You start to think about that statement. The soul is nothing. Well, we don't believe it's nothing in the sense that it doesn't exist. Well, what could they possibly mean by that? And then we start to figure it out. What we figure out is that around us is this world of things. Most of them are, some sense, available to our hands, to our eyes. But then there's also this whole world around us of things like emotions and thoughts. But, we're told, the self is no thing. It's none of those things. We'd already realized that, perhaps, when we started to look inward, but we hadn't seen it so clearly, that it's not anything that we can identify. Now, where does that leave us? That leaves us with, first of all, a hopefully enhanced sense of our humility, of our limitations, the idea that we aren't omniscient, all-knowing creatures. In fact, the very essence of ourselves is something we can't grasp, is an unknown. Plato had his dialectic method, and if his dialogues are a monument to anything more than to the Platonic doctrine, they're a monument to that idea, because what Socrates is doing in those doctrines is he keeps sowing nets. He tells you, no, it's not this, it's not that, it's not this, it's not that, and gets you around in a circle, and he'll keep doing that until he's got something in there, perhaps the idea of virtue. And you've got 100 things that it isn't, but you still don't know exactly what it is. And Plato, perhaps the greatest rationalist who ever lived, said that at that point you must take a leap of intuition, that your mind will do you no good. You'll either grasp it, very Zen-like experience, or you won't. But you've done the most you can do with your mind. You've cleared away all the things that it isn't. Similar idea to something that Michelangelo once said, that when asked how it was that he so furiously chipped away at a block of marble and got the statue in there into form without seeming to have any doubt about what he was doing, he stated that the statue was already in there, that he was simply chipping away the stone that was accrued around it. He saw, in other words, the way that the marble's form agreed with his own vision, and simply had to make that vision real. Zen painters do a similar thing. In both those cases, in Michelangelo and in the Zen painter, we have the case of the mind working in selflessness. Only by losing a sense of who we are, losing a sense of where that statue is going to go, how much money it's going to make us, whether or not the artist living down the block is going to be jealous about it, and all those things. Only by losing that can we be so sensitive that we can, in some way, almost indescribable, enter a communion with that block of marble and be able to bring something really special out of it. The best Japanese woodcutters, and many of the best European ones, for example, have a way of using the grain in the wood that creates a really amazing effect. It's as though they have simply taken the natural form and slightly polished it, slightly accentuated it, and there you have a creation, as opposed to the kind of man-handled sculptures we sometimes see that are cut right across the grain and then have to be carefully polished so that they don't look too bad, that sort of thing. But in these cases, the grain agrees with the subject matter. So, the mind, then, is one of the things that the no thing of ourselves has some kind of relationship to. And I say some kind of relationship because I want to define that also. There's the idea, perhaps, that we have to use our will to gain control of the mind. Perhaps we meditate, and our conception of meditation is that we put a lid on our thoughts, and we hold it there for however long it is we meditate. And when a thought bubbles up through it, we slap it aside, and we hold down harder on that lid. And chances are that by the time we're through meditating, we're ready to go out and just blow up at somebody because we're so irritated. Now, the actual approach to meditation that one usually runs into in the various traditions has us do something quite different, which is we just watch the thoughts. We don't run with them. We simply relax with them. We simply allow them to pass through our consciousness and observe. There's an interesting hint in that, and that hint is that our minds are really not our instruments. Any of you have had the experience of thoughts or ideas that kept coming into your minds when you didn't want them to? I'm not necessarily speaking of an obsessive psychosis, but simply some recurring theme from a television show we watch too much or something like that. Perhaps have had a sense of that. The thing just doesn't exactly follow what we want it to do. And then in addition, even when we sit down to do something like a math problem, there's that element of trying to wrestle our attention down. And attention is the key word here. I want to differentiate for a moment between attention and the mind. It's one of the failures of Western psychology that there is not sufficient understanding of the importance of attention. For example, attention is a need in many ways as powerful as needs for food or sex or self-esteem. People will do amazing things to get attention. We all have different levels of it. Some of us need very little, but we need something. Some of us can settle with a little dog or a pet of some sort that will occasionally come to us. That's enough. Others need to have millions of people clapping and holding up lighters and that sort of thing. It's the only way they feel that they're getting attention. Not only do we need attention, but we need to give attention. Television, for example, is not just a kind of cavalcade of fantasies that we can sit and live vicariously through. It's simply a way to give attention. In many ways, it's a kind of poor meditative state. You're hypnotized. You're basically motionless for long periods of time as you watch these changing lights, and you're lavishing attention on it. And very often, one will go to movies, to theater, to lectures, to pay attention. Not really to listen, but to just pay attention to something, because we feel that it's about time that we went out and paid attention to something. Attention is a separate faculty from our thoughts, from our minds. Our mind works when our attention is fully engaged, and here is the wonderful paradox and also the key to using our mind in the best possible way. And that is that when we are paying a lot of attention to getting our mind to work right, it isn't because we're short-circuiting the whole process. We're paying attention to the mind. The mind is asking us to pay attention to whatever it is we're supposed to be involved in, and we're much too busy in the interim process. What we should be doing is paying attention to whatever it is we want to do. So, for example, if you have trouble sitting down to do the math problem, and you spend the next 10 or 15 minutes worrying about getting those thoughts disciplined, and just, why can't you just think about it? Just get that problem in there. You're not going to get that problem done very well. But if you say, okay, fine, I'm feeling a little bit antsy, but let's find a way to make this problem interesting. In other words, how can I engage my attention? How can I really make this into a puzzle that I want to solve badly? Then your mind will begin to work like that. Now, an example of that will be, some of you may have had this, if you think back to any time that you had school and you were assigned a book, and if you had another book that you wanted to read for yourself. You may never have noticed this, but for instance, the book that you had to read for school may have been 2 or 3 times simpler, easier to absorb than the book you wanted to read for yourself. But the fact of the matter was, when you sat down to read the school book, it was like breaking rocks. You just read the same sentence over and over, and you weren't retaining it, and your memory just didn't seem to hold on to the material. But when you turned around and started to read the book you wanted to read, no matter how difficult the subject, whizzed right through it. An excellent retention. Why? Because when you were reading the book you wanted to read, your attention was focused on that book, on that idea. When you were reading the book for school, your attention was focused on the fact that you were reading the book for school. You were thinking of the teacher, you were thinking of the homework, you were thinking of the tests. All those other things were draining attention and draining the ensuing mental processes, the thoughts that could have been on that book you were supposed to read. So what we need to do then is to cultivate an ability of concentrating, of attending carefully to whatever it is we need to do. Now that can be as simple as housework. Housework is an excellent way to do this. Or even simple bodily hygiene. Usually by the time we reach about 17, 18, maybe for some older, for some younger, doing things like washing our faces or brushing our teeth cease to be conscious activities. We may think, oh, I've got to go do that, or I'd like to go do that. But once we start doing it, we really don't pay much attention. Maybe we get some good cavities or something, and then we do for a month or two, but that's about it. In Sufism, as well as in Zen, you will be sometimes given exercises where you have to not only pay attention to how you are brushing your teeth, but you will have to pay attention to how you turn on the faucet, how you fill the glass of water, where you place the glass of water, how much water you take into your mouth. Sounds like a maddening process. But the idea is to so focus your awareness and your attention on that mundane task, to really build up that muscle, that when you are now approached by a more complicated and more distracting task, it's already built up for you. The muscle is ready to lock into it. It's naturally interesting. Housework is the same way. Housework can be the source of existential despair. Any of you who have been sweeping and you thought to yourselves, I've swept this floor in 20 years, probably 20,000 times, and it's still dusty. And one day I'm not going to be around to dust it. It's just going to be dusty, and that's the end of it. You can look at it that way, and that shows a very interesting thing about the mood you happen to be in at that moment. We can find despair around us all the time. Well, on the other hand, you can say to yourself, well, this dusting is a good opportunity. It happens all the time, and if I want to be, you can call it a tad superstitious, you can call it optimistic, whatever you like, there must be some reason why I have to do this incessant dusting. When God decided how he was going to create the world, he made all this dusting. So there's got to be some reason for it. And the obvious idea is that if we really pay attention to the dusting, if we really do it with a certain kind of focus, it becomes one of the greatest modes of meditative discipline available to us. It's a lot easier and a lot more glamorous to sit down in a specially painted room with little sticks of incense and a nice pillow, and we feel very spiritual and very Eastern, and it's lovely to meditate that way. But when we're wearing a pair of lousy old overalls or something like that, and we've got a broom in our hands, and we're cleaning up the little bits of cat food the cats have left all over the kitchen floor, it's not so glamorous. but much more effective, much better time to practice that kind of pointedness of mind. Beyond that, one can find that the thought processes are unleashed, and I promise you that the most innocent housewives who seem to just be the pictures of domestic bliss and anti-feminism, who just clean and cook all day long, may be Einsteins, who are just sitting there thinking up the most amazing things, but they don't have the tremendous ego that needs everybody to applaud them, so they just keep sweeping and thinking up those things. I've known a couple of them. But attention and the process of flexibility. If, once again, we're optimistic about our world and we have the idea that it's a world of opportunities and not a world of traps to avoid, we can approach every situation with a tremendous amount of curiosity. When we do that, the mind works overtime. If you've been around children, you've undoubtedly heard them say things that were horrifyingly simple and unanswerable. Einstein liked to say that science would actually begin to achieve something we're going to answer children's questions, and of course it can't. For instance, why is the sun, or things like that. Those marvelous questions we can only say, well, and give some other answer to that really doesn't answer the question. And the wonderful thing about it is the child will inevitably give us a very bored look within a minute or two and go off and do something else, thereby telling us in the clearest manner that it has not been fooled, even if we have. But the child has that curiosity. The child has that sense of wonder at the world, of wanting to understand how it works. And of course, you've heard in all the various scriptures that before we can get to an enlightened state of consciousness or to the kingdom of heaven, whatever you prefer, we must be like children. There's several elements of being like children that are there, including their sense of humor and resilience. But in this particular lecture, I want to focus on a dynamic having to do with this attention thought paradigm that I think is the key to the entire path of enlightenment, particularly for Western civilization. And I'm going to put it in a single phrase for you and then discuss that phrase. And the phrase is that we truly begin the path to enlightenment when we cease desiring to be understood and begin desiring to understand. That is the key. Now, to explain that, most of us want desperately to be understood by our worlds, and that takes a whole hierarchy of levels. It begins with the fact that we want to be understood by our friends, by our spouse, by our family. We want them to be kind to us, to be considerate, to understand why we do certain things, to have a certain harmony with us. And then it extends all the way from that point to the point of wishing to be understood in the sense that we are an artist, a homemaker, a businessman, a banker, whatever it is, and we want to be understood as such. We may have, for example, an idea in our minds that we are talented in whatever field we favor, but we don't know that until we're successful in it. And if you think about the logic underneath there, what you're asking for when you're asking for that success, when you want it for legitimacy, is understanding. You want everybody else to understand that this is your particular talent. Your focus then is on society understanding you. Now, in general, that doesn't happen. Some of us are fortunate and we get to a certain place. We're able to achieve a level of understanding that's satisfactory. But in many cases, we walk around feeling that we're not understood. It disturbs us. That tremendous cliche that pops up in sitcoms now about my wife doesn't understand me. That's just been dragged down for centuries, it seems. Still, perhaps the greatest complaint of our society. We're not understood. Our coworkers don't understand us. The government doesn't understand us. Our family doesn't understand us. We are simply not understood. Now, that should be a tremendous hint for us right away. If nobody understands us, only ourselves, chances are we don't understand ourselves, and maybe everybody else understands us. Think of it that way. But the magic turnover, the magic beginning of the change, is when we decide, I don't really care about being understood anymore. That's usually the function of either a lot of frustration or a lot of self-searching. We suddenly realize, I don't even know what I am. I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my emotions, I'm this combination of things. Why do I care if I'm understood? I don't understand myself. Could leave it at that. But I'm awfully curious about the world. I'm really curious about other people. I want to understand them. I want to understand the way things work. Now, what happens when we do that shift? First of all, because there are very few people around who want to understand others, we're going to get popular fast. If we're really willing to listen and we really mean it, we really want to understand, we can do a terrific amount of good. Because in general, simply listening is one of the greatest therapeutic methods that have ever been used by mankind. Letting somebody talk enables them, using the mind in a very fluent fashion, to put things together, to kind of make it all fit into a puzzle that makes sense, at least for a while. And it's surprisingly difficult to find people who will listen. It's so difficult, in fact, that there are psychologists all over the world making lots of money listening to people. And that's really what it all comes down to. Listening. So we immediately find that our circle widens. We're liked. People want to speak to us. It can get annoying sometimes, perhaps. But as long as we keep that curiosity, that desire to understand, it doesn't annoy us too much. Maybe we need a rest, that sort of thing. But we still want to know. We want to see what happens. Now, when we extend that a little bit further into a curiosity about the dynamics of the world, we find something else interesting happening. For instance, we feel that we have a talent to be painters. Painters or bankers. Let's use those two examples. Now, instead of wanting to be understood as such, in other words, getting a phone call from the Otis Parson Institute, who we've never had anything to do with, but they've heard of us through the grapevine, and they say, we want to give you a scholarship immediately because we know you're talented. We can just tell by the rumors. Instead of that, we're very interested in the way the art works. Perhaps we have a favorite painter or a particular financier who did a particular kind of thing. So we just begin to take apart what they did, see how it worked. We get our own hands into it. We try things out. We experiment. And all of a sudden, we develop mastery. We know our tools. The combination of the fact that we are tremendously easy to work with because we're curious and we listen and we're flexible, and the fact that we've mastered our tools because we're so curious about how they work, adds to a very simple thing, and that is success. It adds to being an individual who can really contribute something. The reasons that the success is there in the way that people see it from the outside may be things like, oh, this is a cooperative person, very relaxed, nice person to be around, those sorts of things. But the inner reason is because we have shifted from this focus on ourselves, this self-conceit of wishing to be understood, and now have become creatures who wish to understand. And that's a tremendous difference. And if you consider, for example, that golden rule that appears all over religious and philosophical literature having to do with doing unto others, you will realize that if you want to be understood, the best thing to do is to try to understand. And what usually happens when we're not understood is that we're so busy being unhappy about not being understood that everybody around us is unhappy because we're not trying to understand them, and it just goes on that way. There are these barriers that are built up. If we begin the process begins to open all around us. That kind of honesty. The second half of the lecture we'll get into a little bit more detail about ways to cultivate this, but I'd like to leave you, at least at this halfway point, with the idea that when we have that kind of openness, that kind of curiosity and attention to a situation, problems dissolve. This is simple fact. We are approached with a situation that really bothers us, that makes us feel very neurotic, we see no way out, we ask everyone around us, how do we get out of this hysteria? And one day, we walk into the situation a little cooler than we were before, and we change it. The way we change it is, we no longer want to be understood. We no longer want some person with a position of authority in that situation to say, I will rescue you. Rather, we want to walk in and understand how the thing works so we can get out of it. And usually when we do that, and we deal with that situation honestly, sincerely, with great integrity, it vaporizes. I'd like to fill in some background to that idea. A long and careful study of the various religious and philosophical traditions that have been given to us, Eastern, Western, Middle Eastern, all of them, indicates an interesting thing. It's something that I think that this center is devoted to, and that's the idea that at the heart of all these doctrines, there's a particular way, there's a path. It differs a little bit, as it should, because it has been given to various people in various places. Obviously, to give a system of discipline to a Bedouin tribe in the Palestinian deserts is going to require a different approach, a different mythology, a different set of techniques, the one that we give to urban dwellers in New York City. And part of the problem, I might add, on the spiritual path is that a lot of New York City dwellers try to live a Bedouin kind of spirituality, or whatever it happens to be, not realizing that it isn't really suited. It needs to be adapted. One of the benefits of the study of comparative philosophy, comparative religion, and mythology is to be able to begin to tell the difference between the doctrine and the symbols that cloak it. It's the ability to read past the surface into the heart of the matter. And of course you perhaps have heard that phrase, the way of the heart or the heart path. And that's what seems to be at the base somewhere in all of these various religions. The founder of the society, Manly Hall, has said that all religions are divisible into two forms, the esoteric and the exoteric. Now what that means is that there is the letter of the law and there is the spirit of the law. There is the letter, which means that we go to a certain assembly place at a certain day, we say certain things, we do certain things, and that's where our religion stops. We simply obey. We conform to the dictates of the law. And then there's the esoteric way. And the esoteric way is the way of the malcontent. It's the way of the egomaniac, the madman, the insecure, the suffering. In other words, it's the way of anybody who for any reason has decided not to be content with the status quo, who's been motivated to understand more. And so they take the doctrine, or a lot of doctrines, depending on their opportunities, and they try to understand what was really meant by the words. They say, for example, using Christianity, what was meant by confession? Why is confession supposed to be good for us? They take it apart. They ask themselves, what's the process in confession? Why would that be useful? They've discovered, for example, that first of all, we speak about something that has been tormenting us. It allows us a chance to, in the presence of someone we respect and feel to be an exemplar, to say, we repent our action. We don't want to do it again. We want to repay somehow the mistake that we made. And the mystics, who tend to get burned for these ideas, then figure, well, I think I can do that, for example, without actually going to confession. I think that I can do something I'm not proud of, realize it, promise to myself I'm not going to do it again, and find some way to expiate the act. Do some act of service for somebody else. Do something that will make me feel that I have somehow paid back that wrong deed. I have paid the debt. I've dedicated a good action in the name of the bad one that I had taken. And then this goes even a step further, and we get things like the Pythagorean disciplines, where the mystic will go to bed, or just before going to bed at night, and review all the experiences of the day. Now, this is not done in a vicious fashion. We're not our own tribunal. We're not supposed to say, that was terrible, and stroke our fingers at ourselves and not sleep over it. On the other hand, we're not supposed to say, boy, that was so enlightened. I mean, I'm practically a Buddha. What we're supposed to do is just be observant. Just say, I did that, I did this. Get a sense of it, a feeling of the causes that are involved. In other words, we begin to recognize that it was that thought in the morning or that action that led to this event in the afternoon. We just recognize it, we just observe it. And then what we find is during the day, all of a sudden, we're about to do some action, and out of nowhere this memory shoots in, and we realize, this is very similar to what happened a few nights ago. I'm not going to do that. This time I'm going to take this other path. In other words, we develop a sense of awareness about ourselves. Now, this whole tradition, let's call it the mystical tradition, keeps talking about one thing, the creation of a new human being. It keeps saying that most people are asleep, dead. They use all those words, anything they can to shock us into understanding that most of us are not conscious. We merely think we are. People of dreams, Plato called the average member of the populace, never waking up. All the traditions talk about this process of gaining enlightenment, the kingdom of heaven, vision, all these various terms, all referring to some state of greater understanding, greater wakefulness, a real comprehension of our world and our actions in it, a sense of self-observance, of seeing the connections and not being simply affected on by them. This process is the effort toward realization of selflessness. It's the process of discovering that we are infinite. It's the simplest way that it can be put. Very often, when I say something like selflessness, there's a little bit of a twitch. It's an ugly idea. It still has ramifications to us that hurt a little bit. But not when we consider what it actually means. And what it means is that when we say we are ourselves, we are making a finite definition. In other words, we think of ourselves as a wardrobe, a set of memories, a set of relationships, a place we live, taste of a certain kind, and we say, that's me, and we make it finite. When in actuality, there is no me like that. All those relations are interconnected with thousands of other things. They're not separate from everybody else's worlds. They have to do with our parents. They have to do with our relations stretching all the way back into childhood. They have to do with the kind of society we've grown up in, with the opportunities in it. They're very much interconnected. They're not completely, then, parts of ourselves. We are actually infinite, then. We can, for example, extend as far as we want out on these relations. Psychoanalysis, for example, is a very good lesson, in the simple sense that what it says is that things that happened to me as a child, as an infant, are still having their effects. So I can extend my relations all the way back into infancy. If I want to go into Janov's primal therapy, I can go even further back to the actual trauma of birth. And if I study Tibetan Buddhism, I can have some real fun and go back behind the womb and right into the Bardo world and see what death was like. But the whole idea of this is this idea of coming to consciousness. There have been all sorts of theories about how that happens. I'd like to share with you one of the, I think, most poignant and also one of the most humble but powerful examples of this kind of approach to life. Quite some time ago, I was doing some research in Winnebago Indian ritual and discovered a very interesting statement, which was that a particular shaman had been a human being for 3 incarnations. I thought to myself, there's a lot of background in Hindu where you have this idea of thousands and thousands of incarnations before you could achieve anything spiritually. What a strange concept. What was he before that? Animal, a bush, and what was going on there? It didn't make sense. Until I realized, a little bit later on with a bit of explanation, that the term human being to the Winnebago shaman has a very special meaning. Chances are that according to a Winnebago shaman, none of us are human. We're all animals. And the reason we're all animals is because we don't remember our past lives. He'd been a human being because for 3 past lives he had remembered all his past lives. He remembered the births, he remembered the deaths, and the descriptions that he gives of them are pretty hair-raising. They certainly strike chords of memory, or at least imagination, if you like. But the point is that there again is a slightly humble Western example of this idea of consciousness, that you actually become human when you break through not only to our goal of being conscious of our own lives, of this one, but further, you're not really human until you've broken through and you remember all the lives that came before that one. Now that may be a goal that is best left out of hand for most of us at this time. At least it comes naturally when it's time to. And at this point in most of our developments, spending time worrying about it is more likely to cause trouble than anything else. Buddha once made a statement to the effect that trying to figure out the karma of our past lives was the truest and most certain method to madness. It had nothing to do with enlightenment. Best to focus on this life, try to understand it. But I wish to point out that little Winnebago statement to show the differences in worldviews. Now, there's a good reason why our worldview doesn't include something like that. For example, consider just a moment the contrast between what our society at large thinks of the Winnebago definition of a human being, at least if we told it to everyone. They'd probably think that the Winnebagos were either savage or insane, and anybody who has been raised in our enlightened modern culture who would buy something like that is really out the door. So, we need to be aware of the fact that our society's vision of the world is very different from the way the world might be. Now, all that aside, all that little trek, that short history of the esoteric side of religions, is intended simply to show that within this tradition, within this paradigm, is the idea of a kind of relativity that far exceeds the relativity in physics. In the tradition, in little out-of-the-way places, we hear things like this: everything is true. Now consider that one for a minute. Everything is true. That means that if I made a statement like, Christ was a devil, that's true. Or on the other hand, if I said the devil is Christ, that would be true too. All the most outrageous things you can think of in some way then would be true. Now, what is this? Another Eastern attempt to shock us into some kind of an understanding. That's something that has to be left to the individual consciousness. I leave it for each of you as a kind of cone. You might think about it. But what it really does, the consideration of that, teaches us that we set the structures of our world. We'll be discussing this when we get to Saturn. But at this point, I'll say at least this, that through our minds, through our memories, our emotions, our acquaintances with the world, our memory, we decide what is possible and what is not possible. We create ourselves. In this society, the major means of doing so is the mind. Now, interesting, in astrology, Mercury rules communication. It has an awful lot to do with television. It has a lot to do with movies. It has a lot to do with books. It has a lot to do with lectures. Any form of the spoken word. And I might add that anyone who has looked into the chart of the United States has found that there's very strong Gemini in the chart, which does several things, among them making us a little bit untrustworthy in foreign relations. But beyond that, that Gemini means that our culture loves to talk. It loves words. It loves to think. It loves all sorts of busy stuff. And it doesn't want to go too deep into it. It wants to have a lot of it. Not necessarily depth, but a lot of it. That's sort of the key. And we do. We've got a lot of television, and we've got a lot of movies, and we've got all sorts of distractions and wonderful things. We've got universities full of information that 99% of us will never even be able to understand because it's all in jargon and that sort of thing. We've got a lot of it. It's marvelous. I mean, any Gemini would be delighted to live in this country. They have everything to keep them busy their entire lives. But the problem is that this is a hotbed for creating mental tyranny. Now, for example, we have a certain problem with the idea of wisdom in this country. Most of us grow up with the idea that the university professor is wise. Now, there are certainly wise university professors, but I beg to differ with the idea that the definition of wisdom is the university professor. As a matter of fact, if I were really nasty, I might offer you a counter definition. But the reason I would do that is because our universities are dedicated to structure, and wisdom is flexibility. It's a very big difference there. Our university professors are masters of information. But wisdom is understanding. These are very different things. And some of the wisest people in our culture are people we never hear about, for good reason. First of all, a lot of them don't want to be on TV and that sort of thing. I'd like to point out that there's a standing reward, for example, of $10,000 to any psychic who can do something in the presence of a magician and several scientists that cannot be proved to be fraudulent. And it's the great delight of people who don't believe in psychism all over the world that nobody has ever bothered to take up that gauntlet. And the thing that's always amazed me about it is the few people I have known who seem to me to be legitimately psychic, or at least in some way involved with some form of cognition that defied normal analysis, could care less about the $10,000 and would do anything to avoid the kind of attention that it would give. But you see, we think, again, because we're that kind of Gemini information crazy culture, that somehow visibility is associated with wisdom. We need to get new ideas then of what wisdom has to do. We need to redefine what we mean by success. Have to look at our own goals, our own vision of life, decide what it is we're really after. For example, many people feel, particularly when they're young and they're setting out on some sort of a career, that what they need is money. Money is the secret to the whole thing. But what they really mean is that they need security, or they need the kind of connections that will enable them to do what they want to do. They don't realize that in focusing on getting the money, they may be missing all sorts of opportunities to actually get connections or to get security in a simpler way. For example, it's very simple to get security by voluntary simplicity. In other words, you have a choice. You can go out and buy yourself a tremendous mansion and work yourself into an ulcer paying for it and get guard dogs and all sorts of hirelings to work for you and that sort of thing and be very secure. Or you can decide you don't need any of that, that all you need is a nice, comfortable little place and a nice, comfortable area, and that's all you're going to want. That'll be enough. Or you may decide with the Zen monk that you don't want that either, that all you really need is just a little cell somewhere in a Zen monastery, and that's it. But you see, the security is entirely in your own heart. It's in your own mind. It has nothing to do with what's out there in the world. So we set up these visions of what we're going to do, and very often we set them up through our minds. Now, I give you that picture of our television-crazed society, of all that stuff that's zooming around in the airwaves. Well, that appeals very much to our minds, and our minds work very much in a visual sense, and so we pick up images. We have, for example, an ever-shifting pantheon of heroes who represent various aspects to us. For example, the very self-assertive, somewhat mean, but certainly strong, powerful woman Joan Collins on Dynasty sort of thing. And that becomes an archetype. A Jungian will recognize immediately that this falls into a pattern of psychological projection. And many people begin in very subtle ways to move toward that because of lack of awareness. Now, you may recognize that there are qualities in that portrayal that you desire, that you actually need in your life. But if you're aware of it and you recognize it, you can be much more efficient in realizing it, in building a foundation for yourself, instead of simply being influenced in a vague kind of way. So what we're talking about then is the use of the mind that the scientist is most interested in, and that is to be skeptical in an open way. It means that we never take anything directly on faith. In other words, boy, I just want to believe, this one makes sense to me, I believe it. We always examine, especially those situations, with a calm reason. We don't say yes or no. We simply say to ourselves, this one I can't be sure about, and leave it at that. Now, this world would be a lot more peaceful, for example. We wouldn't have so many religious wars if people were willing to say, I haven't experienced this. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It simply means that I haven't experienced it. So I remain open but slightly skeptical. Now again, look what's happened to the idea of skepticism. Most people think of skeptical as an acid. It eats through everything. It's a terrible thing to be skeptical. It's a kind of confusion between skepticism and a kind of pessimistic materialism that disbelieves everything out of sheer nastiness. That's not what we're talking about in skepticism. We're talking about being comfortable with the idea that we can't know everything in the world, that there are mysteries in this world that will remain mysteries, at least at this time, and that our minds are much better turned to the simple, concrete things around us, that that's where the most can be done, and that in the natural process of transmuting ourselves, of transmuting our minds, we need not to focus on the goal because we have no vision of the goal. We need only to focus on the transformation. As we transform, the vision grows with us. We have experiences that are so dramatic, they entirely change our perception of the world. But you see, we couldn't have predicted them. We may have read about them 100 times in various books, very detailed descriptions of them. And what we discover is that when we actually have the experience, we realize we never understood what it really meant when we were reading in those books. Oh, we agreed with it, it sounded good to us, and we hoped to have that kind of experience, but we really didn't know what it meant. We go back, and now all of a sudden, the words leap to life, and they couldn't be any simpler or any more direct. It was the most honest statement this person could make about the experience they had. For instance, in mystical experience, you will continually get things about subjective light. And this great light, this glory of light blazed before me, that sort of thing. And you think, I'll accept that. I'm going to be a little bit open, maybe, maybe not, but sounds all right. And then one day, you have a vision of the subjective light and all the things that go with it, and suddenly you realize it was all real. It's a tremendous experience. But you see, if you had vainly, and it would have been vainly, striven to have that experience, if you devoted all your effort toward it, you wouldn't have gotten there. The way you got there was more likely than not learning to be patient, learning to be kind, learning to want to help other people more than wanting them to help you. Those little things eased away the blockage, eased away all the obstructions that stood in the way of vision. And even after you have the vision, you still focus on those simple virtues, on the kindness, on the consideration. And you simply use what you saw to make that process easier, richer, deeper. But you don't fixate on it. You don't put it in a cage. You don't say, I had it, boy, this was it, and hold it up and show it to everybody and that sort of thing. You just reapply it for more inspiration, more energy, more commitment. Same thing with any department of our lives. In a personal relationship, if there's someone that we know that we really wish to have an involvement with, the way to go about it is not to imagine how terrifically marvelous and wonderful that involvement will be and have detailed fantasies about every aspect of bliss and wonder that will be the result of this union between two people. We don't do that because that accomplishes nothing. What we do is we, again, focus on what we can do for the other person, on the kindness. We focus on what kind of sharing can happen there. Same thing in business relations. The same principle of fundamentals. And the fundamental of all fundamentals is ourselves, not in the sense of a soul that has to be somehow purified, because that selflessness, that infinite thing we are, is far beyond our ability to purify it. It simply is. But we can certainly work on all the little tools that are within our field of attention. We've got our emotions, we've got our mind, we've got our body. Then on the next level, we have our relations with other people. We've got the house that we live in. We've got all those things. Those are the things we can work on. They are the art, or rather the objects that we can turn into art. Some of you may have known extremely spiritual people, very spiritual. They were perhaps the most unpleasant, confused, irritated, messy people you'd ever met in your lives, but they would hasten to convince you that they were on the very threshold of Buddhahood. They were just that close. They knew all the stuff in the secret doctrine, the secret teachings, and every other secret book that was ever published. It was all memorized, it was all down. But it didn't do them very much good. No application. The fundamentals were left untouched. Now, on the other hand, you may have known somebody, if you've been fortunate, who was a very simple person who didn't know any of that stuff, but whose house had a certain feeling about it, this really wonderful feeling. and who was kind, and who was open, always seemed to be there when you needed them, and never intruded on you. They were just there to help, and then they were gone if you didn't want them around. They always seemed to be able to make you laugh. They made you be able to smile, cheered you up, made you feel a little bit more optimistic. Now those people were getting awfully close. And for all we know, those people may have already been there. Never forget one of the greatest axioms in the Hermetic philosophy, which is that everything in this world is the opposite of what it appears. You can have a lot of fun with that one if you play with it. The people who appear to be happiest are often the most miserable. The people who appear to be the lowliest are often the highest. A good example is that in Sufism, there's a particular path called the path of infamy. Now, in general, Sufis in the past, and even in the present, have not been aghast at living very luxuriously with a great deal of fame and importance. That's all right by them. They don't feel attached to it. They use it for good ends. Works out fine. However, they will tell you now and again that there's another kind of Sufi. And that kind of Sufi is very often much more advanced than the visible guru type. And that type is on the path of infamy. That type is playing the fool. That type always says the wrong thing, always does the wrong thing in the wrong place. That type always gets all the anger heaped on him. But if you're very attentive, you will note that every time that one does the wrong thing, he's made somebody see something about themselves, if they were just alert enough to catch it. That one little act of provocation was a kind of mime. It was a reflection. It was showing somebody a bad part about themselves. And here is another key where Mercury can help us, and that is in the understanding that in general, when we look out into the world and find things we don't like, find people we despise, it is something in us that we despise in them. I'm tempted to tell you this is an invariant rule. When someone has a fault that we have conquered, we tend to feel compassion for them. We would like to help them. Or at the very worst, we simply stay out of their way. But it doesn't resonate with us at all. We simply say, I was there and thank God I'm not. However, if somebody has a fault that in some way is related to a problem that we have, boy, then the sparks start to fly. We really react. And it may be very subtle. It may be that the particulars of their fault, the particulars of ours, are completely different. But there's something underneath there. And a little bit of that Mercury, a little bit of curiosity about it, will quickly reveal what it is. And it can be a very startling discovery. But in general, when you're in a situation that irritates you, that's a terrific opportunity to put Mercury to its best use. Not to sit there and think about it, but to get curious. To say, what could it be? What could it be? What is this person doing that bothers me? You try and pin down exactly what it is, and then you look into yourself and find the chord that harmonizes with it. What have they called out in me that I should hate them? Tremendous amount of projection involved in any kind of violence in relationships. So therefore, tie it up a little bit, the Sufi on the path of infamy is attempting to stimulate that very thought in all the people that he contacts. He's reflecting back at you your worst faults. There are now some famous stories going around put together by Idries Shah called the Mullah Nasruddin stories. They're a great deal of fun, and they're about the fool, the Mullah Nasruddin. And of course, the fool is a Sufi master. And the foolish things he does are intended to show us the foolish things that we do. An example, a very simple one that I've repeated often because I like it so much, and I think it's perfect for Mercury, is the fool, the mullah, is sent by his master to go get a cup of sugar and a cup of salt in the marketplace. So he goes down to the pantry and he gets himself a single cup. Then he goes off into the bazaar. He finds the sugar merchant and he turns the cup over so that the bottom of it is up and says, okay, give me a cup full of salt and put it right up here. The merchant shrugs and gives him the salt. Then he turns around, he goes over to the sugar merchant, turns over the cup, and of course all the salt falls out, and says, "Now put a cup full of sugar in here." So he gets the sugar in the cup. Then he goes back to his master, and his master says, "Fool! I told you to bring me salt and sugar. Where's the salt?" So the mullah promptly turns over the cup and says, "Here," and loses everything. Now you can see that this is a perfect symbol of the way many of our minds work. We get fixated on one thing, and then all of a sudden we reach for the other. No middle ground. This pendulum swing of black and white, these extremes. But what we really need to find is the golden mean, the balance between them, the way to balance the sugar and the salt. Or, even better, to realize that we don't have just one cup. That we've got hundreds of cups in here. We've got room for all the information we could possibly want to put in there. One of the popular fallacies that's going around is that there's only so much room in your mind. You just can't, single lifetime you can't remember that much. And of course brain cells are dying off like flies, and you just can't take care of it. That's not true, as a matter of fact. Biological research has shown that the brain cells are indeed slowly dying off, but the simple fact of the matter is that you can get something like, I think it was 100 new bits of information every second of your life for 90 years, and you'll still have millions and millions and millions of little cups to put information in. You've got all the room you could ever want. It's all there. And other experiments have shown that every single memory, the most precise sensations, are still locked up in here. When a small electrical current is put into the mind, into the brain actually, memories pop out that we thought were completely forgotten. So it's all locked up in there. Jung felt that the reason we can't get at it is because we're too nervous. For instance, we're faced with a situation where we have to remember a number or something like that. We get so worked up about trying to remember the number that we obviously can't. Our attention is engaged on the effort to remember and not on the problem. Now, on the other hand, if we simply relax and feel optimistic that when we need it, the number will be there, I guarantee you, 9 times out of 10, it's there. It's very surprising. Another example, and this is a lovely thing to say at a lecture because some of you are taking notes, is that experiments, and I've done one on my own, have been done with the idea of note-taking at universities, that sort of thing. And I have taken classes in which I diligently took notes, notebooks full of them, and did all right. And then I've had other classes where I didn't take a single note, but I really listened. I was very curious. Every morning I tried to go in there and say, I'm going to find something really fascinating today in this lecture. And the result wasn't that when I took the notes I did badly. The result was when I took the notes I did well, and when I didn't take the notes I did well. But believe me, I had a lot more fun not taking the notes and not studying them when it came time to do the test. But it was this optimism, this retention. Now, I listened to other people at the very same situation who said things like, I studied for this test for 2 weeks. I did this and this, and I blacked out. And why did they black out? We say tension. But I would suggest we add another little syllable and say attention. There was so much attention on getting ready and so much attention on remembering that there was no room to remember. Everything was focused on this confusion. So we need to learn then, again, this flexibility. And I'd like to share with you one very simple technique for it that is available regardless of religious belief. And that is something that science has vouchsafed to us, the size of our cosmos, that sort of thing. The facts of life, let's put it that way. For example, you may be having difficult relations with somebody in your family, a neighbor, whatever you like. Now, first of all, you can apply that technique of what is it about this person that's like me that makes me irritated. And if that doesn't work, if you just still want to be irritated by them, they just bug you, you might consider the simple fact that that person is going to die, and so are you. It's one of the few things we can be sure about. We don't know whether we'll be conscious or not afterwards, but we do know one thing. We're not going to be here, at least not in present forms. And in general, even if you don't like somebody, it takes a certain amount of intimacy not to like somebody. You have to know them a little bit at least. If you consider the fact that they're not going to be around, it makes it easy to imagine what it will be like then, in a very simple way. In other words, one day, I may be here, and this person won't be. If it's the other way around, You don't have to worry about it. But they may not be here. You can imagine yourself feeling that it might have been nice to have gotten to know them. There might be a few things you're curious about. I wonder why they did that or why they did this. I wonder how this irritation started. All these little mysteries you may be left with. Now, if you take this into immediate family, if you take this to a mother or a daughter or a husband or a wife who you're not getting along with, you have an alienated relationship with, it can really work wonders. And the simple thing is that this is not a magic trick. This isn't some meditational technique. This is a simple act of awareness. The simple fact of the matter is that death happens, and that we fritter tremendous amounts of time away on petty frustrations, on little things that have to do with our ego selves. We really don't need to. And if we can just be aware of the fact that we have this limited amount of time, even if you want to believe in reincarnation, still, this particular body, this particular place, these particular people are here for now, and that's it. The reality of it being lived now does not recur. So, why waste it? Why make it ugly? Why not make it something beautiful? Why not act with full awareness of where you're going? The Arabs, during the period of the great Muslim expansion, were tremendous warriors. Over a period of just a few years, they swept all across northern Africa. They conquered Persia with less effort than any army had ever conquered a major empire. No problem at all, just swept through. How? Well, people talk about Bedouin ferocity and how harsh the desert made them and this sort of thing. They had one little saying that said it all, basically, and I think it's the key to what made them great warriors. And it's the key to what makes all of us great warriors, in a sense, in our lives. And that key was that they would blissfully tell you, if this is my day to die, then there is nothing in the world that can stop me from dying. But if this is not my day to die, there is nothing in the world that can kill me. And so when they went into battle, they were most ferocious enemies, because you couldn't kill them if it wasn't their time to die. They had that strength of faith. Now, you can get that even without being a Muslim or even without being a believer in God or karma or any of those things. You can get it from the simple idea that someday you're going to die. That's simple. That awareness. And I'd like to point out to you that if you're getting it here, you're not getting it. When you get it here, and there's a moment of anxiety, there's a little bit of a wrenching, you got it. But when you feel that, you begin to transform your life. You begin to realize, wait a minute, let's do something really beautiful with this. Why make it something unpleasant? Then what happens is you begin to function creatively. You begin to function as a potent force moving out into the world. You find a kind of energy that you've never had before. It's amazing what can be done when you're focused that way. When you walk into a situation, and without saying it, you're putting out that kind of, boy, we don't have much time here, and it's such a beautiful place, and let's really do something positive. That's that kind of Horatio Alger positivity that's been sadly perverted in our culture and dismissed. The source of it is a kind of spiritual, mystical feeling about reverence toward life, appreciation of it. Maybe the best argument for immortality is the fact that every single one of us behaves as though we are immortal. We waste time, enormous amounts of time, in very unimportant things. And we tell ourselves, no, I can't go out and appreciate the world. I don't have time. I've got to be busy. I've got to make business deals and open up a new store or start a new relationship or move out of the city. There's just things to do. I got no time to appreciate. You see, appreciation, and you know, of course, how that's connected with attention, is one of the greatest things that we can do. And when we realize what a tremendous amount of time we really have, how much time is spent in transit, waiting for a phone call or an appointment, the period before we go to bed or just after we get up, all sorts of periods of time, even in the middle of work, A moment when we just kind of want to pull away and rest for a second, maybe take a brief walk, that sort of thing. Those are all opportunities for appreciation. Those are all opportunities for noticing beautiful things. And they can be very simple things. I mentioned to you earlier the Huayan Sutra. I'm going to leave you with a little something from it. In it is a wonderful beginning that is a tremendously long list of names. Could really drive one mad, but they're very beautiful, so it doesn't. They say that there are these kings and these spiritual beings and water spirits and kings of this and that, and then they name them all. But their names are beautiful. And each of the names corresponds to the virtue of that particular order of beings. So, for example, for the ocean spirits, there's a lot of talk about the infinite play of light will be a name of one of the deities. Or the symbolization of the ever-changing world of samsara will be another name for the deity. But the one that leapt out at me before giving this lecture today was one that was called the sound of passing clouds. Now, if you can take a moment at any time, day or night, if there happen to be clouds in the sky, and look out the window and listen for the sound of passing clouds, and appreciate for a moment that quiet, the sensation that goes with it, that slow movement of the clouds, and you will have begun to really gain appreciation for life, a sense of your infinite selflessness, and, best of all, you will discover that your mind, that ever-busy monkey leaping from tree to tree, is staring with you, absolutely fascinated, and very still and quiet. So appreciation is perhaps the one banana that will satisfy the monkey. And appreciation is something that all of us can practice anytime, any place that we are, about anything, whether it be the dust we're dusting, the broom we're using, the person who invented the broom, if we want to get a little bit intellectual, the people around us, the light outside, or the sound of passing clouds. Thank you.